about business cybersecurity and technology relationship between India and China. And I have known Subimal for over 3 years, and the Subimal's working life has been concerned with building bridges. Allow me to just introduce some snapshots from his very impressive work in the past. He's a globally recognized defense and cybersecurity analyst based out of New Delhi, India. Until recently, he was the country head India for General Dynamics, which is one of the top 5 defense corporations in the world, and was responsible for guiding the General Dynamics business units. In addition to that, Mr. Bhattacharjee is a globally acclaimed speaker on cybersecurity issues and has been an invited speaker at the Council on Foreign Relations, East-West Institute, based both in New York, the Institute of Peace, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Chatham House in the UK, Indiana University, Bloomington, European Security Roundtable, the list goes on and on. But if I were to summarize Mr. Bhattacharjee's working life and his passion, I would say he had been building bridges, and there couldn't be anyone better as our keynote speaker for the theme of juxtapose. So now I would hand over to Subimal. Please welcome him for our keynote speaking session.
Thank you, Adya. I think this was quite a lot. But I'm happy, when you put an ignorant man on the topic as the last speaker in a 2-day conference, you don't have the full attention of everyone around, so you can pass on a few things which need not necessarily shows the ignorance. But having said so, when Adya first made the reference about this event, I thought that this was a great opportunity for me to sit for 2 days and learn a lot about where the dynamics of the India-China relationship goes from the academia and the research community. Because we, in the business community, we just pick up snippets from here and there. We don't go much into depth, and hence very many times miss the attention. Now, my personal experience as someone working for a long time in the defense industry, someone having a little bit of an academic interest in cyberspace as it grew in India for the last 15 years or so, and a kind of a globe-trotting role that I have a certain idea about where this relationship is going between the two countries. And much that I would have loved to sit here and listen, and particularly this morning that I wanted to hear what Adya was speaking on the cyberspace issues. I just couldn't do, because yesterday, whole of the day I was in Bombay, today all of the day in the Ministry of Defense. But luckily, this, I didn't ditch any one of you, I at least came to speak. So just give my thoughts, and maybe, it could be a much better way to communicate. The happy moment for me was when I entered here and I saw that cybersecurity has been added. Before that, I saw only cooperation and technology, and I thought that I'll be fish out of water if I don't come to cyber and, of course, defense. But having said so, now that I see business, cybersecurity, and technology between the two, I think fairly I can talk about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and then we could speak on the question. Now, on business, I think you are more well informed than where we are. Across sectors, we know that a lot of, and of course, a huge trade deficit shows, how much of what we are, or the stuff that we get out of China in this country. But if we move closer to, the domain where I operate, defense and electronics, there's a huge business that happens out of, or between India and China, where we are one of the largest importers of the cell phones and all the related stuff, and if I'm not mistaken, more than $1 billion worth of stuff I think we would have imported in the last few years. And when in this country of closing, or I can say comparative population compared to China, when each of us are trying to cover our digital gap, and all of us are becoming mobile enabled and then smartphone enabled, every chip that goes into the handset, which we, in our cybersecurity or in defense terms, we say that this is the first and the most vulnerable point in security. We have to import each and every of this chip from China, whether we like it or not. And despite all attempts by DRDO and the funding that is going into having some indigenous chip development in the country, we are nowhere near that. We are still toying with the idea of having through one of the DRDO labs in Hyderabad, Anurag, much beyond the quad core and hexa-core chips, but we are nowhere near that. So we will still be importing those handsets. I don't have an exact figure of how many chips or handsets we are importing at this point of time, but if we look at roughly about 20% of our population today are coming closer to a cell phone as well as mobile and the internet connectivity. So all of them are using a chip that comes out of China in some form. So that's a big business, and I think it's just not going to die away. It's going to continue, and we can see if there is an opportunity to cooperate. I don't say that in chip technology much has happened out of China. I think it's still a manufacturing activity that happens there, but possibly some amount of the technology that is been or technology development that has been working there, and what we have been trying to do, maybe we could bring a synergy, because leaving aside the sensitive part of the chip, I think there are many other areas where a combined effort can improve the quality of the mass scale smartphones and devices that can go forward. And leaving aside the other areas of garments and other trade, what I would like to immediately jump into is the larger landscape around cyber. I'm sure Adya covered most of that, but more than cyber security, if I take the larger encompassing aspect of internet governance, and this is an area where possibly we could see some cooperation, and we could also see a lot of conflicting positions. In fact, just to tell you at this point of time that much of the deliberations are happening globally about whether we can come together in terms of getting a working model on internet governance lying through UN, without UN, multi-stakeholderism, multilateralism. And I happen to be in the Research Advisory Network for the Global Commission on Internet Governance, headed by the Swedish Foreign Minister, which is just at the point of time looking much on where internet fragmentation is happening. Let me tell you that China and Russia are seen as in completely a different direction compared to what I would say the OECD bloc of countries, the America-led entities about what's going to dominate cyberspace. And India is caught in between. I don't say caught in between, but I think India is still trying to grope its position, because we ourselves are unclear about what position we take. Way back in 2005, I'm reminded of a cybersecurity conference at Nice, one of the big events that mark, or it used to be popular even then as it is today, the RSA conference, the RSA Europe, where the Chancellor of Oxford University, Lord Chris Button, had gone up to give the last keynote example. Well, I might bore you all, but even at the last keynote, he kept everyone on their feet. And most of the questions that flowed to him was what he thought about where the India-China relationship would go, and in 10 years from now, who dominates the other. To my satisfaction, as an Indian sitting in that crowd, he definitely said that India had a much better future in terms of the growth and or rather I would say inclusive growth compared to China. But 9 years after that keynote remark by him, if you see in many indices, possibly China has gone much ahead than us. It's not that we have fallen behind, but we still are trying to get into place, because we are still not clear in terms of a policy position that we would want to take on cyberspace, internet governance. China has a certain kind of a position that they have been trying to put across since 2007-8 that we want a much more democratic internet, despite we hating democracy in our practice. We want more freedom for others, but we'll throttle freedom as far as cyberspace is concerned. And some other countries which generally are very regressive, they have taken a position with China. The UN forums and all avenues on internet governance saw that they were not very structured as it is becoming today. But what is happening right now and where it has evolved from maybe in the last 6 years, precisely 2008, if I take you back to when the UN Secretary General had organized a group through the UNIDIR in Geneva, something called the Group of Governmental Experts on Cyberspace, which was a motley group of about 20 countries, but I'm sorry, it was 2009, and I happened to be one of the 30 people to set the agenda for that country to talk, or those countries to talk about what would be a kind of a reasonable behavior and way of cooperation. Now there the Chinese, incidentally the Chinese delegation comprised of 7 persons, we only sent one of our second secretary from the permanent mission in UN to go and sit there and attend. And while there was a break, the Chinese guy, or the head of the delegation, walked up to me and said, why don't we look at cooperating together and taking a common position on cyberspace? I called the second secretary, I said, here is a good offer, why don't you take it, why don't you send your official report back? I came back here, I personally went and told the current president of India, who's to be the foreign minister, then here is a great opportunity. You could shape it up because the Russians and the Americans are also looking up to India to take some leadership role in whatever global internet governance mechanisms comes up. We didn't react. We possibly lay low. The then foreign minister referred me to the then foreign secretary Shivshankar Menon, who later was NSA in the previous government till the month of May. While as an NSA he was forced and it took up much to look at the internet governance measures, but then at that point of time it went off the radar. So we never came to a position that we could have taken a position that we could cooperate possibly with China or take a position where we could also be in conflict with them on the public policy front. However, having said so, and in the journey in the next few years, 2009, 10, 11, 12, very interestingly, despite BRICS being formed and BRICS taking a journey forward, consciously we tried to keep most of the cyber discussions out of BRICS and confine it to more to an IPSA, which meant minus China and Russia. And based on the IPSA deliberations, and particularly in October 2011, after an IPSA summit in Delhi, based on an agreement between these 3 countries, India proposed at the UN General Assembly session something called a 50-nation CIRP to manage all the resources on the internet. Basically, CIRP stood for Committee on Internet-Related Policies. And however unwieldy it might look, the government of India possibly tested waters about how the international community would take it by using an opposition member of parliament, Dushyant Singh of the BJP at that point of time, to give that speech at the UN General Assembly. A lot of criticisms came the Indian way because outrightly the OECD bloc of countries by then had already kind of taken a position that India or globally it should be more of a multi-stakeholder approach to dealing with internet governance issues rather than taking it on a multilateral table and giving a platform to countries like China and Russia and maybe Iran and all to sort of dominate the agenda. So this continued. A lot of countries came into dialogue with India on internet governance issues, and finally, while we haven't still said that we would stay away from supporting and endorsing and carrying forward our proposal for that 50-nation SIRP, but what a lot of people or most of the Western countries saw that India was more or siding with China on this matter. In fact, I clearly remember last year at the US Institute of Peace in Washington when I was speaking, one of the former Assistant Secretary of State, she stood up and said after the lecture that, in cyberspace matters, we find that India and China are almost moving on the same track. How do you justify that? So, while the Western countries might have had an opinion, but I don't think there really was anything that we saw that we were cooperating or moving towards the kind of a position in internet governance to tackle it together. Now that much more structured discussions are happening, despite India-China dialogue happening and some kind of I don't say fillers, but some kind of indications have come from the Chinese side about what should be a position that could be for the greater good as the way they think. India still isn't kind of in a decision state about which way to go. So after the new government came, as Mr. Modi traveled to Brazil for the BRICS summit, this was for the first time he, in his first speech at the inauguration, said that cyberspace is something that BRICS should look at. Of course, everyone says it's a global commons, but this is something that BRICS should look at. And later in the joint declaration also, BRICS taking up cyber space issues, including cybersecurity, was mentioned. Now, to an extent, the votaries of multi-stakeholderism, the OECD countries led by primarily by US, had almost taken a position in the last 1 year that multi-stakeholderism was the way forward. So, and seeing that this was more of a IPSA activity than a BRICS activity, had already started taking a position in the whatever dialogue happened with India about what are the merits of being in a multi-stakeholder forum and not remaining, kind of taking an isolated position and trying to help towards internet fragmentation the way they think. After Modi's visit to BRICS, the first opportunity that came up for India to present itself in any multi-stakeholder or anywhere where everyone met was the Internet Governance Forum meeting in last month, September. This is still September. So the 3rd and 4th of September at Turkey. Interestingly, we never sent an official government delegation except delegation from NICSI. So we stayed away, but next month there is an ITU plenipotentiary meet at Busan in South Korea where we would be forced to send an official delegation. Once again the discussion would come up. So we are at a point of time where the new government has to grapple with the issue of taking a position, whether you are on the multi-stakeholder or multilateral side. There's a lot, if I talk, it will be, there will be a lot to talk about this, but fundamentally what I can say is that while we are not directly cooperating, we are not also opposing each other. We have a certain kind of a position which we think could help both the countries. India and China would be the two leading countries with cyberspace citizens or digital citizens in the next few years. So I think there has to be a certain level of cooperation, if at all, to keep the internet medium free and open for communication. Now, the other aspect of technology, which before that let me touch a little bit on cybersecurity. Now, per se on cybersecurity, if we are saying there is collaboration, there isn't anything really worthwhile except the CERTs, the Computer Emergency Response Team of the two countries who exchange notes, and on a regular basis, of course. But company to company, industry to industry, there isn't much per se on cybersecurity. Around the information technology business, yes, there are, but primarily driven by the hardware interests. So there is an opportunity to foster a proper, I can say, working relationship on cybersecurity. Now, while I say this, I must also point to the fact that while a major cyber attack emanates, or even without emanation, you would hear a lot of the Western media already blaming China for that particular attack. And this is regular sometimes, and there have been instances also where I don't say proof has been provided, but definitely references are there from large US corporations about how they felt they were being spied, or even whatever email system in Pentagon was hacked. But India has been very, very careful never to immediately call that Chinese have attacked or Chinese entities are involved in attacking network, except from a small reference by the former NSA, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, to some of the computers in his office in PMO, having some networks which were traced back to China. I don't think there has been any kind of an acquisition at any point of time. So, which I can say is a very, very good thing, because it hasn't spoiled the relationship or spoiled the atmosphere on which both the countries can talk and have certain kind of cooperation on cyber security. Now, related to this, I would like to touch a little bit on the defense technology, because since we are neighbors with this huge 4,000 kilometer border, and then the string of pearls are regularly thrown, and that's a very popular theory, and China is going to each and every one of our neighbor, offering them a lot of assistance, including those that can have severe surveillance and other implications, and of course army help with defense technology and arms to some of our neighbors, including Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Pakistan. I think this is one area that is of concern. I liked the earlier session when I saw the word co-production, because there is an element which will also say that why kind of India and China would be always mutually exclusive when it comes to co-production, anything on defense. But now, in terms of technology, the defense technology, where it is going on, we are no way really anywhere forward. Everywhere, if you open the newspapers, you would read about India's defense modernization as always an important target. Every year we are saying we need to indigenize it, we need to build all our equipments here, but we still end up importing 70% of the stuff. We are one of the largest importers. In fact, we are the largest importers as per CIPRI data, and our exports are nowhere. Defense exports are almost zero. In fact, last year total defense exports out of this large country like India is just $80 million. So it's nothing. So whereas China is already exporting in billions. Now, if you look at some of the low-end technology like the armored vehicles and the M16 guns and all, some of them are coming in our region from China. Most of them are being given at throwaway prices. We, despite our spread of weapons, we bought historically on and on from the Russian and the Eastern Bloc countries. We have bought strategically from UK and France, and we have also recently bought enough from the US, and extensively we continue to buy from Israel. While in terms of numbers, US has now become the largest seller of arms to India last 2 years, but consistently Israel has been growing. The Russian imports are still stable. But we haven't really been able to build up a great military industrial complex in the country, unlike what China has done. So, on a comparative scale, and whenever your or India's threat perception is compared, it is done, I would say, or rather juxtaposed with Pakistan and China together, because both these have the threat element built into our national security. So we don't see that there is a possibility in technology. Now, most of the warfare that's going to be fought in the future is moving more towards technology-oriented electronic warfare, and all the ammunition that you have seen so far operate in its own domains with whatever armored and artillery and infantry getting the support from them. Now they are all coming into a C4 kind of a structure: command, communication, control, computers, along with that intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Now, in that atmosphere where it is the software that controls, or the command and control that controls which tank hits which, or which missile attacks which, or who targets whom. In this kind of a scenario, I think we are still far away from ever thinking that we will cooperate. I think we possibly are seeing situations that much of our arrangements in a kind of a C4 enabled atmosphere to fight the next generation battlefield will be designed around each other countries' networks and capabilities. In fact, much of the weapons, or the fighting tools for next generation electronic warfare would be built around each other. So this is really an area of concern. I don't think this can be improved. Now, in terms of US and the Western technology, and strategically where India's defense needs or ecosystem is going, I think there is a large importance attached by all the, you can say the P5 countries minus the Chinese, about building closer defense relationships with India. And one of the very important things I touched on co-production was that US is a country which has offered India very categorically that it wants to build a defense relationship which is enhanced by co-production and co-development. Or rather, I should say co-development and co-production. In fact, originally 10 areas were identified, and these are still not in the public domain. Now about 96 areas have been thought about. This is a significant, I would say, change which possibly has happened in the last 5 years, where whenever US came tried to sell something from a buyer-seller relationship, the government, the industry, the local industry here, everyone tried to push across the point that it has to be a kind of a partnership model. So Ashton Carter, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who's just left the Pentagon, he worked on a formula and he worked with the National Security Advice, and much of that, the co-development and co-production, in fact 8 out of 10 is just centered around technology. When you look at it, this technology or such kind of a technology the US would never have with China. US has, or conveniently and necessarily, possibly they have used the Chinese manufacturing capacity, but the transfer of technology to China has really never happened in any domain, or particularly in defense it would never be offered there, but it has been offered to India. And the very strict ITAR regulations that the US has, to say the International Trade in Arms, all these restrictions for India are getting much easier, almost coming to their whatever standards they do for the NATO allies. So this is another area that if we are going in the direction of cooperation and all, and we pick a certain leapfrog and all, then we are far away again, moving from China. And I think there is a perceptible difference that possibly China sees also this as a big threat, that the development of C4 capabilities, the development of armors, the development of modern artillery guns, space systems, even the 5th generation aircraft and the submarines that are there. So everywhere defense, there is a possibility that the technology could in itself become one of the biggest point of concern between the two countries. But having said so, despite all cooperation that possibly India forces with the US and all, I don't think that that really would be singularly directed towards China or publicly, or anyway it could be anyway thought that it's directed against China. I think it's a question of the economics in the market, and of course feeding the big Indian vacuum in the defense market in India. But I will just possibly stop here to discuss and take questions. But before that, I want to leave a very, very interesting fact that I was in a meet in Boston where a lot of Indians and Americans were talking on defense and technology, and a lot of flags were there. The flags on the table, the US flag, then the Indian flag, and all these flags were made in China. So, one of the biggest symbols of our patriotism or our national, key symbol, that's also now being outsourced to China. So, despite good and bad things, I think we'll still cooperate and have situations where we'll oppose each other, and technology will remain at the forefront of such a thing. I hope I have been able to talk something sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Subimal. So may I open the floor for questions?
I have a question, actually. First was, you talked about cyberspace, you talked about business, as a business, and technology, and defense. Oh, sorry, I don't know what I was telling you. This morning, actually, Adi was also talking about India using Chinese standards. I'm wondering about the extent to which cyberspace as an issue, like not actually what it is, but rather as a political issue, is being used as a political tool in game, basically, in a regional game, and whether that strategic play actually allows things to happen in cyberspace while nobody's looking, because there's so much attention being paid to cyberspace as a tool, and there's a sort of disconnect between what's actually happening and cyberspace as a political issue. And then I had one other question, which was, will this co-production of what you described as C4 capabilities with the US actually have any real benefit for India in the longer term?
The first point, first question, very interesting, and it's a very relevant question. To an extent, yes, it is a political game, but if you look at the larger picture, now still the business of cyberspace or the politics of cyberspace is controlled by the US, whether we want it or we don't want it, it controls. And I don't say rightly so, but then they have been the pioneers. They have had, they gave a free internet to the world, and so far their track record through ICANN, whatever the INA functions they have done, that hasn't shown any discrimination in any form. Now when they see that the shrill voice for getting or rather for democratization and opening of the management of the internet resources is coming up, they see that if it becomes a kind of a you versus me or 3 countries versus 5 countries and all, they think that internet is going to fragment. It might not remain the way as it is, and everyone would have each other's internet, and the Chinese have done sufficient work through all their Baidus and other whatever networks they have to sort of be standalone and be happy and throttle and control and run the internet the way they want it. The Americans are saying, and if I may add a little bit further to what all I had spoken about, in March this year, the US came up and said that we are willing to give control of the INA functions under certain conditions. 4 conditions are laid out, and those INA functions are primarily managing the resources of the internet. So basically, something that has been an American function through, of course, ICANN, which is a non-profitable organization since 1998. One fine day suddenly they have said they are going to give it to the internet community. But the first condition they said was this has to be a multi-stakeholder forum. The moment you are multi-stakeholder forum comes, then in a table which possibly is sitting people with diverse experience but more or less around research, but that becomes the extensively or disparate organization. You would see a Google sitting, you would see one of the universities sitting, you would see 3 countries sitting, you would see a lawyer sitting. So anyone who is a stakeholder in internet suddenly comes to a point where he is going to have a say, and they all have to come to a consensus. Practically speaking, it might seem quite a bit of a difficulty, considering possibly that we would still try to think that any internet governance functions should somewhere be around national sovereignties, and hence it is to become a multilateral scenario. But if you look at it, the point of view that comes is that if so many stakeholders are there, the private sector controls 90% of the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure that runs the whole medium of internet. So if you keep Cisco out of the game in which you are trying to take a decision, or if you try to keep Microsoft out of the game, or if you try to keep Google out of the game, are you being representative of what actually would make the internet function smoothly? So this is an argument that's still being debated. It's going to be there for another 2-3 years. This debate would happen, but the politics is built around this. The whole politics is whether this is right or whether that is wrong. If you are in a multilateral scenario, as the Chinese and the Russians are pushing, possibly from an Indian point of view, it also has other implications. For India, it might also have an economic implication, because today, this year, we are exporting $100 billion worth of software and services. It's been growing. Every year it has grown, even at the height of, when the economy was doing bad globally, even in 2008-9 period, and Indian software industry still grew at the 10-13% bracket. And 95% of those exports are to the multi-stakeholder regime countries. Can we take such a big risk, to actually move away, oppose vehemently and take a multilateral role? No, we can't do it. Possibly the economic interest that time would take over the political interest that we might still have in trying to espouse a much more fair or democratic position, or rather a more of a position built around sovereignty. So I think the politics that will go on will continue, but over a period of time, when we are ready and we take a decision, it's definitely going to be taking care of the economic interests that we have, because it's employing so many people, we are exporting so much, it's significantly enhancing towards the GDP, and more than that, it has a great impact in the Indian social scenario. The IT sector has kind of brought a lot of changes in the way the country sees functions and is respected globally. So the politics continues. In terms of your second question, co-production, of course India will benefit. The question always, or the point that always used to be put when, and I worked or headed for General Dynamics, we have some of the cutting edge technologies. So every time you would have gone to the Defense Ministry or to the service headquarters, the feeling always was, you are giving us technology which are 5 versions below or 4 versions below. It doesn't matter to us, we need the highest version of technology. So, and this is not unique to GD, it was to Raytheon, Lockheed, everyone who sold here. So I think the collective wisdom from the industry had its impact on the US government. So now, if the co-production starts, and the identified co-production are in areas that India really needs technology. So if this happens, and when this comes, and 1 or 2 already are at a point of takeoff, it's just not going to be confined to the Indian public sector. It's also going to come to the private sector. When defense was opened in India in the year 2001 to the private sector, And now much of the programs that are going to come are possibly, being rooted or being framed in such a way that the Indian private sector participates. And there are specific two programs which are only, the public sectors, the HAL and BEL and the Indian Defense Public Sector, and they can't participate. It's only the private sector who can participate. So it gives a great boost to the private sector guys, because effectively they haven't really invested in R&D as far as defense is concerned to really take off things. So once this technology comes and a co-production mechanism starts, at least the Indian industry is going to benefit, and apart from benefit with the technology absorption and the inherent jobs, I think the level of military industrial complex enhances, and hence the capability of fighting and enhancement also happens. So I think it's a very positive development.